Welcome to the Behind the Grantmakers Curtain series. This collection of interviews with different foundations aims to help grant seekers craft more effective grant proposals that win funding. This series is brought to you by Instrumentl, the institutional fundraising platform. If you're looking to bring grant prospecting, tracking, and management to one place, you can do so with Instrumentl. On average, nonprofits apply for 78% more grants within a year, helping them win more grants. To do the same and find new good fit funders for your nonprofit, try Instrumentl 14 days free by visiting www.instrumentl.com. That's www.instrumentl.com. Now, let's jump into today's show.
Today's conversation features Elisa Fiaschetti, the Grantmaking Program Officer for the Montana Community Foundation. It's a helpful reminder in which we explore themes like ensuring that you read the grant guidelines, how to best prepare for your grant proposals, how to demonstrate effective budgets, as well as sustainability for your nonprofit. Elisa shares a few of her tips and tricks, as well as a few helpful frameworks that you might use when working on your own applications. Let's go ahead and jump in. Today, I'm really excited to bring on the Montana Community Foundation. Since 1998, the foundation has worked tirelessly to create permanent philanthropy and build stronger communities. MCF has managed more than $125 million in assets and administers more than 1,300 philanthropic funds and planned gifts. MCF has reinvested more than $90 million in Montana alone through scholarships, grants, and programs. I'm really excited to bring Elisa Fiaschetti, the Grantmaking Program Officer for the Montana Community Foundation today. Elisa oversees all the grant making for the foundation, from creating grant guidelines and applications to reviewing applications. Elisa's previous work has been in grant making and grant writing in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors, so I'm sure we'll explore some of that in today's conversation. Elisa, thank you so much for spending the time with us today to have a chat.
Great. Thanks, Will. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I'd love for us to kick us off by you telling us a little bit more about the foundation. What's your foundation's origin story, and who do you aim to fund today?
So, you did a great overview of the Community Foundation. Really what we do is we work to help kind of work on two sides. We help donors throughout the state invest their funds wisely and allow them to help invest in Montana and in Montana communities. So through a few different programs, through our donor advised funds, donors are able to make grants that way. And then we also have competitive grants with some special interest funds and make grant making that way. And really the goal is to help Montana communities thrive through philanthropic foundation work.
And when you dig into some of those competitive grants, how would you describe your overall grant making strategy?
Each one is really driven by our donors just because of the way that our foundation works. But we're really, we look at within that special interest, within that field of interest, we really look at what the needs are, what maybe needs are not being met within that field of interest, and see how funding can be geared towards those organizations or those communities that need it most.
And something that I know foundations often have to go through are just reevaluations of that grant making strategy. So I'm curious if you could share how that's changed over the years to your knowledge. And when you guys do go about those changes, how do you approach that process and doing those needs assessments?
Sure. Yeah, we look at every year we reevaluate both our guidelines and our applications to make sure they're clear and make sure that they're meeting the needs. When you look at an application and asking the question, why are we asking this question? Is this question that we're asking applicants getting to what information we need? If it's not, let's take it out. So just reevaluating every year to make sure, anybody looking to apply for a grant, there's clarity in our guidelines and they know what we're looking for. They know the purpose of the grant in the funding. They know what can be used or what the funding can be used for. And then again, that the application itself is as clear as it can be for both the applicant, but as the reviewer, also having a clear, concise application is really important. And so for each one of our competitive grants, we look at it differently because each field of interest grant is different. So we kind of have it with the lens of that. Most of our field of interest, we'll have experts on our committees. And so that really helps. I'm not an expert in all of the subjects. So we bring in folks that know and understand those topics in order to help guide the guidelines and the application and the review process. And they help throughout every year when we do reevaluate those strategies, kind of as things change in their field, we adjust accordingly.
I'd imagine that additional perspective really adds nice balance to just overall perspectives for that cycle as well. Speaking of applications, we like to dig into some overall advice and tips for grant seekers. So I'm curious to kick us off for this portion, if you can share one of your most common mistakes that you often see grant seekers make when it comes to applying to your foundation.
That one, it seems really simple, but not reading the grant guidelines, I think, would be number one mistake that folks make, is to not actually read fully through a grant guidelines and then the application. Sometimes somebody just sees, oh, this is a grant, it seems like it fits, but sometimes when you get an application, it's pretty clear that organization or that grant seeker did not read the guidelines. So I would say that is kind of my number one suggestion, is to make sure grant seekers really read and understand what they're applying for.
Of all the conversations I've had thus far with Grantmakers, I can tell you that you are not the first person to give this advice for our listeners. So to hammer it home once more for folks that are listening today, reading the grant guidelines is definitely one of the most common mistakes that people don't take notice to. So on that note, I'm curious if you think back on either the latest cycle or just some recent cycles, what have been some of the most memorable grant applications that you guys have funded, and what specifically made those stand out from the rest of the pack?
I think one thing, and this kind of speaks a little bit to what we just touched on, is it's those applications that, sometimes you get grant applications that are trying to create a project almost to fit that grant. And so some of the ones that, the ones that we see come through are ones that's what they're doing. The project it's happening, whatever that might be. And this is just a good, they see this grant and they apply for that because it fits, rather than kind of seeing the grant and then pushing the project through the process just because it kind of fits. And so it's those ones that really meet the purpose of what those grants are. And so that's, I think, really key, is those ones that they meet that kind of intention and purpose of the grant itself.
So when you think about the competitive grants for the foundation, what's like an example of somebody that's met that purpose?
We have a media arts and a folk arts competitive grant, and through it's the William B. Pratt Endowment Fund. And there was a application that came through this past spring for a documentary on missing, murdered Indigenous women. And so that project itself is a phenomenal project, but it was also a great match for this grant and the purpose of this grant. And so I think that's really important, is it's sometimes you have a phenomenal project, but it doesn't mean that it meets the purpose or the intent of the grant. But this one, it really checked all of those boxes and is a really impactful project.
And how do these applications that typically get funding, how do they go about crafting that grant narrative? That's something that we hear about a lot in terms of the importance of crafting that narrative. What are the component parts that you notice of those folks that are better able to craft that narrative versus the ones where it feels a little bit more disjointed, like you mentioned, and being written
Mhm.
for the grant as opposed to, with it standing by itself alone?
I think having, a lot of it's having forethought and really thought about the project. And sometimes it's because the project is long term and it's been going and this is not their first grant application, or, but having, not just here's the grant, but here's our milestones, here's what we hope to accomplish, and really having the whole picture before you sit down, before you apply. I think sometimes grant seekers can have a great idea, but if you don't have, here's that idea, here's how we're going to execute it, and here are all the steps along the way to execute that, um, then it can be really difficult. So I think that that's really successful applications have that kind of big picture, um, as well as that small, the kind of detailed picture of what what they're actually going to do with the funding. That they have a specific use for, say it's $10,000. They have a specific use for that money, opposed to we're just going to apply for $10,000 and we're going to figure out what to do with it after. But they actually know where that's going to go, how it's going to help that project, is really an important part of successful applications.
Yeah, when you're talking about the foresight there, it reminds me of when we're in grade school and our teachers tell us to map out our 5 paragraph essays by parts. And similarly, it's just taking the 5 to 10
Mhm.
extra minutes to do that, but allows us to have so much greater clarity and precision as to how we're addressing each of the guidelines as well.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. I mean, as a previous grant writer, I've literally put out the what is it, the who, what, when, where, why, how, and really answering those questions. I mean, it's kind of the same, really the same idea is that basic structure of meeting, meeting all of those questions.
And with your past experience as a grant writer, I'm curious if you could speak more on what you've taken from your past experiences being on the other side of the table, so to speak, now, and what general things or patterns you've noticed have potentially changed over the years from the grant seeking side of things, and what are some overall trends that you notice are emerging more and more between the grant maker and the grant seekers?
I think one thing that, and I don't know if this is necessarily a trend or a way that my mind has shifted, going from grant writing to grant seeking, but the kind of importance of the relationship and the openness of a relationship, between the grant seeker and the grant maker. I think there's often this perception, and I've had this perception before, that, oh, we're applying for this grant, like we can't ask questions to the grant maker, we can't ask for clarifying questions, it's just you're on your own, you make your best proposal and you send it in. But having that dialogue between the grant maker and the grant seeker is is really important, because there's going to be questions, and if there's, from my perspective, I'd rather have somebody reach out and say, what do you mean by this question, or is this project eligible? Does this project meet the criteria? I'm not quite sure. And having that open conversation is really important. And I think I would say most grant makers welcome that conversation, and that grant seekers shouldn't be afraid um, to reach out and make that connection.
That's something that's been a common sentiment in speaking with a few different foundations at this point, is that there's generally just more and more opportunities for grant seekers to be connecting and actually building a meaningful relationship. I've heard of a different variety of ways in which grant seekers can do that. Something as simple as, actually picking up the phone and calling and whatnot, or sharing some new updates as to some events you've been working on. I'm curious, from your experiences now with the foundation, what have been some of the methods that folks that have been effectively building relationships with you guys have taken to really open the door and make that a two-way conversation and actually be building towards something together?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's as simple as what you just said. It's picking up the phone or even just an email. Now Zoom meetings and face-to-face virtual meetings are so common for all of us. Any of those are really a good way to start that relationship or conversation. And it doesn't have to be as formal as a Zoom meeting or anything like that. It can just be an email introducing yourself or a phone call to say, hey, I'm going to put in this application. Anything like that. It doesn't need to be a formal, in my opinion, it doesn't have to be a formal, conversation, but just having that kind of that touch point to talk to folks.
hmm And I'm curious, in thinking a little bit more about your proposal evaluation criteria for those competitive grants, how you guys approach that proposal evaluation and how has it potentially changed over the years as well?
So for each one of our competitive grants, we work with a committee. So it's not just me looking at the applications and saying yes or no. I look through them to ensure that they're eligible. They meet the basic criteria for the application or for the grant. And then it goes to a committee. And again, these committees are made up of experts in whatever field that is. And each one is ranked differently. Sometimes some of them have an actual ranking score, but looked at objectively about, the impact that project is going to have, the sustainability of the project and organization. And those are kind of the big ones. We don't want to give a grant to a project or an organization that doesn't really have a long-term or stable plan. And so those are kind of some of the overarching criteria that we look at, that they have a budget that's thought through and makes sense. Both an organizational and a project budget is really key. So looking at kind of those on all of the competitive grants are really those objective viewpoints that we take. In Montana, it's in a sense a really small state. So a lot of times our committee members, they know the person or they know the organization more often than not. And so we really try to we take that objective view of, yes, I might be very familiar and love this project, but is it checking all of our, do they have a budget makes sense? Do they have, all of these things is really important to the process to make it, transparent and clear and objective.
Something that I know that a lot of our listeners will have questions on is around budgets. I'm curious if you can speak a little bit more to what makes an effective budget, like you said, for the two types of budgets of the organization as well as the program itself. What are you guys looking for? Since I know in past conversations with other community foundations that there are varying degrees to what they kind of look for in these budgets, since it's very case by case and dependent on where the organization is at as well in their capacity. So I'm curious if you can speak a little bit more about when you talk about like a good budget, so to speak, what does that really mean?
Mm-hmm. And, it looks different depending on, if you're talking about a business, if you're talking about a nonprofit, if you're talking about kind of depending on what that is. But generally speaking, including a budget is number one to make sure you have that. And if you're looking at, an organizational budget, that it's, financially a stable and organization that you can pay your bills without this grant. And I think speaking to the project budget is just knowing that the difference between a project budget and an organizational budget, that the project or the organizational budget is what are your yearly expenses, what are your yearly revenue for the organization as a whole, and then the project budget being we are going to build this community center. Here's what our administration costs are going to be. Here's what our construction costs are going to be. And, if it's something that is maybe out of the realm of whoever's writing this, well, I don't know what the construction costs are going to be. Talking to an expert and actually knowing what those costs are going to be, and being realistic about what those are and putting those in there in as much detail. When you say administrative costs, well, what does that mean? Personnel, well, what does that mean? What does that include? So just having a detailed, clear budget so that the grant makers can see, and making sure what you're asking for is an eligible expense is really important, and just really making sure what you're requesting in your budget is part of the purpose of the grant, is really important.
Yeah, from what you're sharing there, it reminds me of going back to your earlier point, aligning it to the grant guidelines, but also another statement that I've often heard, which is don't assume that your grant maker knows the ins and outs of your organization. A lot of times, grant seekers make this mistake where they're so invested in their impact and whatnot that they forget that somebody that is reviewing this application doesn't have the full breadth and depth of knowledge around their organization as they do. And so just taking a step back, defining things in your budget is really important for folks as well. Before we head into the second portion of today's conversation with Elisa Fiaschetti, we want to tell you about Instrumentl. Instrumentl helps grant seekers bring grant prospecting, tracking, and management to one place. If you'd like to give Instrumentl a try, you can create your own free account at www.instrumentl.com to get personalized grant recommendations for your nonprofit. In the case where you're ready to upgrade, you can use the code Foundation50 to save $50 off your first month. Nonprofits that use Instrumentl increase their grant application by 78% within a year of using us. Now, back to the episode. I'm curious in kind of exploring the side of renewing grants as well, if you guys do any of that. And if you do review any renewing grants, what do you guys do differently with those grantees as opposed to the new grantees? And how do you prioritize those different applications, especially when it comes to the different opportunities with your foundation?
So we don't have any that are kind of an automatic renewal. Folks or organizations can reapply for most of our competitive grants year after year. And what if there's an organization that applies for the second year, we really look at, well, did they accomplish what they said they would the first round? How did that project go? How was did they submit project reports on time? Did they submit them at all? Did they complete that grant? How is this grant different from the last one? And sometimes it's the same. Sometimes it's just, we're continuing this project. It's a long-term project. We're asking for the next phase. But really a lot of it's looking at kind of the stewardship of the funding that they had prior, for the first round. And so when they reapply, making that a consideration. If they didn't submit project reports if they were required, or submit a final report, if their communications was really poor, those are certain things that we consider looking at another application.
Got it. And when you talk about those project reports, I'm curious if you could share more about the extent to which an organization should be preparing those sorts of reports. What is valuable to you guys as the grant maker to see within those reports? That'd be helpful, because I think that sometimes folks aren't fully sure as to what to include in a report, what to potentially leave out, and things like that.
It really depends. I mean, each grant, some of our grants don't require a project report. Some of them do. So that goes back to making sure you read the grant guidelines, and if you have a grant agreement, whatever that looks like, generally it's going to spell out, we would like to see a progress report in 6 months. We would like to see a completion report within 6 months of the project completing. So it really depends on, not every grant with MCF or out there is going to require a progress report. Usually it's going to be kind of spelled out. It's really just looking at that. I would say if you're unclear, ask the funder, ask the grant maker, what do you want to see in this? Because some want 5 sentences that say, here's what we did, here's a picture. Some want a full report. Some have a specific format that they want it. So I think that's where the communication goes. If it's not clear in the guidelines or a grant agreement, what that looks like is to ask. For us, we really like to see just it's more of a check-in. It's more of a, what are you doing? What does this look like? We like to be able to report back to our funders to say, here's what your money is doing. It's, and be able to provide pictures. If it's not all projects are, you're not taking a snapshot of pictures, but so a lot of it's just going back to having that open relationship of asking what a funder wants, because it's different depending on the grant. in grant writing, again, done a 2-sentence, here's what it was, here's the money we spent. Whereas other ones have been a much longer kind of progress report of what the grant is or what the project has done.
Yeah, I've heard a range of responses relating back to it depends as well. Something as simple as in some situations, funders literally taking just some of the social media updates and rolling it up into one place for the report as well. Eliza, something you talked about earlier was sustainability being really important. And I know that some of the listeners for this might be in a space where they're working on the newer side of nonprofits in which sustainability is still a question that even they're answering. I'm curious when these organizations are starting to assess grant opportunities and whatnot, what are some of the tips or thoughts that you have for them to start demonstrating to grant makers that they are building towards sustainability in the long term for their organizations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that can really be a tough one if you're a startup organization. Can be really hard to get, as many people know, general operating costs. There's not a lot of grants out there that do general funding and operational support. So that can be really tough. But I think going back to a comprehensive organizational budget and showing that you have a plan, whether you're, maybe if it's a business plan, if it's an organization, you can still have a 5-year plan of here's where we intend to, if it's a membership organization, here's what our outlook is for membership and dues. Here's what our events might be. Here's what our projected grants might be. Here are the ones that we are applying for. And even if, you can't guarantee that you're going to bring in $50,000 in membership dues or that you're going to bring in $100,000 in grant funding, just showing that you've at least put that forethought into here are the organizations or here are the foundations or grants that we've looked at that we know at least meet our qualifications and we have a good chance of. And here's, what we propose we'll be asking for. So not just saying, membership dues, throwing out a number, grants, oh, we're going to do 100,000. Well, what are those grants? What are those organizations that you're going to, or foundations that you're going to approach? What are those member outreach? Are you doing an annual appeal? Are you doing a special appeal for some special event? So really just showing that you have a plan in place, even if maybe your bank account doesn't show that you have a whole lot coming in right now, but you have a plan. And not every funder is going to take a chance. There's going to be funders that are going to say, come back in 5 years when you are up and operating more. Some are going to, able to take that risk and could fund them. And so I think it really depends, and having that, just having that forethought of you have a plan for your organization is really important.
Yeah, I thought you summed it up really nicely there, and tying it back to that earlier point you had in forethought as well, in which it all comes back to planning, right? It's just having everything in one place, whether that's like a master sheet where you're starting to consolidate everything that you need before you start applying to all the key qualitative and quantitative data points that might be helpful in a proposal. On the topic of proposals, after you've applied, I'm curious if you could share a little bit about your experiences from the grant maker's perspective in terms of some of the best ways that grant seekers could ask for feedback from funders, since sometimes they have questions around that, and what might some of the preferred methods for somebody that might be reaching out to your foundation might approach that process of establishing that open relationship with you guys.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it kind of goes back to that simple open communication. If we, if we're not going to fund a project, I call that organization or that business and say, here's why, and I let them know. I think one thing to understand is sometimes you could have a really great project or a really great organization, and it might not get funded because there's only so much money. And that's, speaking from MCF or any other foundation, there's only so much money. And it's really, these decisions are really hard. I've never been in a committee meeting where, there's very few times, unless it's just not a good application or a good project, or it doesn't meet the guidelines, it's hard decisions. And so I think one thing for grant seekers to understand is that I would say most funders are taking the time. They're really thinking through this, and it's a thoughtful process. And they, if we could fund everything, we'd fund everything with that meets these goals. And so just sometimes, this sounds terrible, but there's not like a great explanation. There's not a, well, you didn't submit a budget, or sometimes there is. Sometimes it's just compared to the other ones maybe met the priorities more. And so it's really hard to, there's not always a really great explanation of here's X, Y, and Z, why this did not get funded. Sometimes it's, there's only this much, we had 10 applications, there's only so much money, we could only fund 5 applications. And so knowing that it's an objective process, that it's a as fair process as we can make it, being humans, and but having that, I think most, if you get a denial letter or a denial email or whatever that might be, and you want feedback, getting on the phone and calling or emailing to say, hey, can I apply again? Do you have suggestions on what we can do better? And sometimes there are specific things like, okay, well, your budget was a little off. And so you can specify that. Sometimes it's, well, it's a really great project, we just didn't have a lot of money this year, apply again next year. So, it's continuing to have that open conversation. And again, I don't think it needs to be necessarily a formal process, unless, and this is just speaking for me, it doesn't need to be a formal process. Some organizations and some foundations or grant makers would like more of a formal process. So it's knowing that from the beginning, if you know that person's that grant maker's communication style from the beginning, I think that's really important. So then kind of, well, at the end, how do we continue to communicate?
I think that extends beyond just the ones where you received a letter of denial. It can even go for the ones that you were successful with, to continue building and strengthening that relationship you have as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really important that folks remember that it's all about that human nature of just building a relationship with other humans on the other side, and thinking about what would be helpful there. I'm curious, if you were to just give one piece of advice for applicants, what would it be? And you can repeat it, the grant guidelines, if that's the one piece of advice. But I'm curious, if you were to kind of summarize to the one big piece of advice that you would give, what would that be?
I would say, to repeat myself, reading, knowing the purpose of the grant and reading through those guidelines, and making sure your project or organization meets that. The other thing I would say is being as concise as possible. You don't need to write, generally speaking, you don't need to write 10 pages to get, your point across, but being kind of concise is really important, I think, in grant applications.
And on that topic of concision, I'm curious if you can speak to some tips that you may provide grant applicants, and especially as a previous grant writer, when it comes to adapting responses to character limits on grant applications.
That's really hard for me, because I've always struggled with kind of being concise. I like to write, and sometimes, so that's something I've really worked on, but it's really important, particularly for, if you have a committee that's reviewing 50 grant applications, to be able to get your point across and I would say, to be able to get your project purpose, your project's impact in a paragraph is great. To be able to kind of hit those points, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, here's what the results are going to be and the impact's going to be, in a really concise way. And so that really goes back to, I think, the projects that have, again, forethought, and organizations that have really thought through their project and they know what that is. They can do that a lot easier than projects that haven't really kind of gone through that planning process of, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, the need that we're meeting, and here's the impact and the results we're going to have. Those are really kind of the important chunks of an application. And if you have a thought out project, you're going to know what those are. and you're going to be able to put them in a short character limits or page limits, whatever those might look like. And so, before you start writing, really sit down and understand what what your project is, why you're doing it, whose needs you're meeting, and what the impact's going to be.
Yeah, I think one of the takeaways for me is it's all about having a framework that works for you, whether that's the purpose and impact in a single paragraph approach, or what you mentioned earlier with the who, what, where, when, why, and how framework. It's just something that will help you really focus in on zeroing in on what you're actually writing towards and planning towards that actual proposal. Eliza, do you have any final thoughts that you think would be helpful to share to help out our grant seeker listeners?
No, I think you covered things really well, and just kind of to drive home the point of, I think, that open dialogue and not being afraid to reach out to the grant maker, the funder, to talk about your project and see if it's a good fit and start that relationship is really important.
Awesome. Well, Eliza, thank you so much for hopping on today. If you want to learn more about the foundation, you can visit them at mtcf.org. This concludes our conversation with Elisa Fiaschetti, the Grantmaking Program Officer for the Montana Community Foundation. If you enjoyed this conversation with this grant maker, you'll enjoy our other ones in our series as well. And if you haven't already, be sure to sign up for your own Instrumentl account to get personalized grant recommendations for your nonprofit. Just visit www.instrumentl.com to see your grants today.